Hello, everybody. As Mel said, my name is Chris Clarke. I head product management for our cloud migration team. So essentially, our charter is to get customers as easily and reliably to cloud as possible. So today, I'm going to talk about a topic that's really close to my heart, which is how to work closely with you guys as vendors to solve for a pretty tricky part of a customer's experience, which is migrating their apps from server to cloud. So why are we talking about this right now? Well, for those who've been watching, we've actually shipped some pretty important features and capabilities in cloud over the last 2 years, and we've announced some others. Everything from Atlassian Access that finally allows you to have your cloud coexist with your corporate LDAP with some important security controls, to SaaS table stakes like encryption at rest, local data centers, GDPR compliance, and ever-improving performance. The other thing is that recently we announced Atlassian Premium, which gives certain customers who want to pay for it the ability to get unlimited storage, 24/7 premium support, and a finance-backed SLA. I'm really happy to report, talking to a lot of customers, that our customers are really excited about it. So much so that we're seeing a steady increase in server-to-cloud migration demand. That's the good news. The not so good news is that as customers are actually dipping into the migration question, they're hitting a huge traffic jam. And that traffic jam has to do with what to do about their apps. In fact, what we're seeing is that for the customers that start on this journey, is they're getting hugely bogged down at this stage of the game. So to dig a little bit deeper, almost every customer that we talk to goes through something like the following phases when they talk about a migration. They go into an assess phase, where they're asking questions like, should we move to cloud? What are we going to gain? What are we going to lose? I like to think of this as like a cost-benefit analysis or an ROI equation, the same kind that you might do if you're just deciding whether to upgrade or not. Then usually what will happen is they'll go into the planning phase, if the ROI equation, as I say, sort of stacks up. At this point, they're coming up with a migration strategy. They're deciding, are we going to move all at once? Are we going to go incrementally over time? Are we going to lean on a partner to help us? Is there merging and consolidation and house cleaning to do? Next up, if they make it through planning, is when they'll start to test the waters. They'll do a test migration. They'll see whether or not their data set is ready, whether our tools can handle it, and essentially build confidence that they can schedule the migration that day of, which is the next phase, which is the migration. So how many in the room have been through a migration of any significance with Atlassian apps before? Okay. Yeah, so those who've done it know that this is a nail-biting affair. It's actually one of the scariest things you can do with our software. The good news is that increasingly, based on the tools that I'll talk about in a little bit, is it works more often than it used to. But we'll get back to it. That whole sort of downtime and what has to happen within that downtime is of key importance to what I'm going to talk about today. And then lastly, assuming that goes well and their jobs are still intact, they'll go into what I like to call the on-ramping phase, where they'll help their users adopt the new digs, be productive, et cetera. So where do apps fit into this? Well, the first huge traffic jam that happens is in assessing the apps. A big part of what you're going to gain or what you're going to lose by moving to cloud revolves around apps. As you guys, I'm sure, well know, is that many customers don't distinguish between app functionality and product functionality. They consider the product functionality to be equivalent to the app's functionality. And so there's a lot here, and I'm going to spend some time talking about it, that we can do to help customers in that assessment of their apps. The next big part where apps start to show up is in the whole test migration loop. So, I alluded to the downtime, but, think about it this way. You have enough to worry about with the core product data. If you also have to think about migrating 10 apps during that process, and you're dealing with a whole bunch of app-specific dependencies, it takes an already nail-biting affair and makes it really, really difficult. And so this is what we're hearing from our customers, is that there's major friction in just getting through a migration because of all of the app-specific dependencies. So what I'm going to talk about today is what we're doing and what we're early thinking on how to solve for these problems. Now, one thing I just want to caveat right here is that this is very early. We have not yet necessarily decided to do all of this yet. I'm here at Atlas Camp for the express purpose to test the waters, to see whether or not you guys would find value in this, and then to involve you guys as early as possible in the process of defining it. So I'm really looking forward for this to being a dialogue over the following weeks and months as we pursue this. So don't think of this as all sort of fait accompli, done stuff. So anyway, I'm going to talk about essentially 3 things. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys a crash course in what we call the cloud migration assistance. These are the tools that you can download today that make it really easy to migrate. And for me, they're kind of the canvas in which app assessment, which will be the next thing I talk about, and app migration will fit. They'll all be part of that flow. And so it's important to understand those migration assistants before we get into the main event, which is the app assessment and app migration. Okay, so let's start with the cloud migration assistance. First, what is a cloud migration assistant? Well, at its heart, cloud migration assistants are server apps, or AKA P2 plugins. And the reason we developed them as server apps is we wanted them to be as compatible with the widest range of versions of Confluence and JIRA as possible, without always having to upgrade to the latest, given that we would be releasing these things on a regular basis. And they've been very successful in that. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. The next thing to know is that there's currently a Confluence Cloud Migration Assistant that's been available since about last October. And we're working on one for JIRA, furiously. And I'll talk a little bit about timelines here in a bit. But the idea is to get Confluence and JIRA sort of squared away. And it would be on the back of that we would talk about the apps work that I'm talking about. And then lastly is know that they were developed to be flexible and reliable compared to sort of the legacy tools for import and export. They do a lot of things to provide more control, more options, and ultimately to be reliable. Okay, just to put a finer point on it, let's dive into the Confluence Cloud Migration Assistant so that you guys can see what it looks like. And just a quick show of hands, how many here have come across this or have used this actively? Okay, a few of you. All right, so the first thing to understand, I guess, about the migration assistants is they're wizards. That they attempt to give people a set of clear and concise steps that they're going to roll through as they pursue their migration. Everything from connecting to cloud, choosing what to migrate, checking for errors, reviewing, and then basically leaving a plan behind that gets saved into a list of plans that can be executed in the future. The next thing to know is that compared to the old export-import approach that has characterized most migrations, we have you authenticating directly to cloud from within server, from within the plugin. So we built a whole sort of connection and authentication layer that allows you from within server to use your site administration credentials to connect directly to cloud. What this means is that you no longer have to worry about the exports and imports of old, where you would sit around and you would do a whole bunch of exports, save them somewhere on your hard disk, then turn around and shove them back up into cloud. We handle all of that for you to the degree of parallelism that we can support in a much more reliable fashion. The next thing is we do give flexibility in deciding what to migrate. If you want to do users or groups, or in this case, because it's Confluence Spaces, you can choose to do so. You can also rerun this as many times as you want. If you've picked up users since the last time you ran it, then think of it as kind of a user syncer. So the idea is that this is a tool that not just gets run once, but can be run multiple times. In the case of spaces, if you choose to move spaces, what we give you is a picker. So you have the ability to choose one or many spaces with each plan that you run. And the idea here is to support all-at-once migration or to support incremental migration. The next thing to understand is we've gone out of our way to build what we call pre-flight checks, which are essentially checks that we run ahead of time to look for common errors that we will often encounter in migrations. And there's some classics: duplicate spaces, username problems, et cetera. And so since we've released this feature, which is actually relatively recently, we've seen an incredible increase in the reliability. By the way, those pre-flight checks should extend to the app migration business as well. In other words, doing pre-flight checks on what you guys will need in order to migrate your apps. And then when it comes to actually sitting down and doing the migration, we've also spent a lot of time making sure that our progress bars don't lie to you, like in some applications. They actually do finish. They don't stop mysteriously at 90%, and then you sit there for 3 hours wondering what's happening. And we try to provide a level of granularity in those steps. And again, to sort of pre-shadow the app business, you could see how app steps and the app migration steps would fall within this same sort of an approach. So think of yourselves as a task that runs in the larger plan. Okay. So the last thing I wanted to show you is just what the plan interface looks like. So the idea is that with each one of these wizard runs, you're leaving behind a migration plan. That migration plan can be run in the future, so you get it just right, so that when it comes to the downtime day, you can just execute it. And you can see like this litany of previously run plans that you can learn from. You get logs on to see, to learn from things that happened either well in the past or not. Okay, so just to cap off with a little bit of roadmap on this for those who are interested. Recently shipped, I alluded to the fact that we added these pre-flight checks that came out, literally like in the last few weeks. The other thing that we did is we made this available for Data Center for the first time. And what we're working on now is we're looking at server app installation usage and cloud availability assessment reporting, which, by the way, is a huge part of this talk. So you can stick a pin in that. We'll come back to that. And then lastly, just by is that we are actually also looking into increasingly supporting test, stage, and production promotion as a part of more natural part of migration, which is something that we've frankly been leaving sort of on the back burner. Okay. Now let's quickly talk about the JIRA Migration Assistant, and then we'll get around to the apps part, which is why you came. What I want to say about the Migration Assistant is that for those who've done any sort of JIRA migration in the past, your options are not that great. A lot of people will do today site backup and restore sort of migrations, which essentially is abusing an old site backup and restore feature to do an entire sort of dump of a site export and then turn around and do a massive import into cloud. And that comes with a lot of downsides. You only have one choice. It's all or nothing. It overwrites pretty much everything on the destination, and it doesn't support any sort of merges, and then it taps out, like ceilings out at some data size and becomes actually very unreliable. The next way that people will often do migrations is that they'll use CSV files. They'll essentially do exports of only 1,000 issues at a time, and then they'll turn around and they'll do piecemeal imports back into the system. The biggest disadvantage of that is that it doesn't actually move any of the global or project configuration data. It just moves issues. So you're forced to handle the configuration part outside of the problem. And it requires all kinds of weird workarounds for things like attachments and sprints. The other one that I see a lot of people do too, who have the guts to do so, is they will literally, if they're trying to say merge multiple projects, let's say JIRA, into cloud, they'll literally dump everything out of cloud. They'll munge the projects into the same server instance, and then they'll turn around and shove the whole thing back in cloud, which you want to talk about a dicey downtime. Do that, right? Not only are you taking longer than you should, but you're risking the data that's already stable of users. You're basically taking their data out and sticking it back in. So, in a nutshell, we're trying to do away with all of these and actually build a purpose-built tool that will do this the right way. And so I'm actually really proud of this slide. I did this. What I want to show you right now is what we're talking about doing, what the JIRA Migration Assistant will look like that will solve this problem. The first thing to know is it's going to support multiple modes. I'm just going to go ahead and build this out. Instead of just being all at once, you'll be able to go all at once or incrementally. So in other words, you'll be able to choose projects and move just those projects. Second thing is it'll handle merging and consolidation. If you have multiple instances, all you have to do is just set the target for more than one instance to the same cloud site, and Bob's your uncle, you now have a merge. And then lastly, for those who want to do it, which is pretty rare, you can split or federate. You can use the same single instance and point to multiple other instances and essentially end up with multiple cloud sites. This is the promise. In terms of user experience, everything I showed you about the Confluence Migration Assistant will be true about the JIRA one. So it'll have all the same capabilities, being wizard-based. It'll connect directly to cloud. It'll allow choosing users or groups, projects or both. It'll check for errors. It'll show future past runs, like all of that great benefit. The difference, though, will be that instead of picking spaces, you pick projects. When these projects are migrated, Currently, what we've built will automatically decide, what the configuration needs to be, both globally and project level, based on the context of the projects you pick. So behind the scenes, what it'll do is it'll actually create the workflows and the schemes, that need to be there to support those projects. One limitation that will be in place, though, is that it will not handle merging. It'll assume that, you're going to be sort of in a lockdown period over the course of your incremental migration. So there's a few things that you'll have to consider when you use it. But the more customers we've talked to, the more convinced I am that they will be satisfied with this for most migrations. Okay? All right, so let's talk about the in the works here. The first thing I have to do is caveat this. All of these dates are targets. They're subject to change without notice. But essentially, we're looking at three big milestones for the JIRA Migration Assistant. The first is an early access program. And for those of you who might have been watching our website, we've already announced the early access program. When we are ready, we'll actually reach out to those that have signed up, and we'll selectively choose you to be a part of our program, in which case you can experience this. Second big thing is beta. Right now, that's tagged sometime early in 2020. The difference with the EAP and beta is we're going to add more and more entities over time, expanding from core project migration to JIRA software migration, adding all kinds of things like sprints and boards, and that'll be the first time it shows up on Marketplace. And then the last thing is the general availability that we expect to have mid-next year. Okay? Now, again, why am I showing you all this? Because app assessment and app migration are going to be directly pinned to these things. Okay? So speaking of that, what about apps? So the part that you came for. All right, so the first big topic here is, you heard Martin alluding to it in the keynote, is app assessment. As I was alluding to earlier, one of the big traffic jams that occurs for customers who are trying to assess a migration is just figuring out their app situation. Can they actually move? Is there going to be an app counterpart available in cloud? If that app counterpart exists, is it at parity? Is there a migration path? So there's all these questions that these guys ask that currently it's a manual process. It's very difficult. I see way too many customers getting bogged down and frankly just sort of getting lazy and sort of doing nothing as a consequence of this. So real quickly, I want to talk about, just so you understand the importance of this and what sort of features it'll have, I want to talk about the pain points just real quick. The first one is it's really hard, I said this a moment ago, but it's really hard to understand, of the apps I have, like it's not hard to get an apps list, which ones are actually used enough to fight for. So a couple of years back, internally, we did our own migration to cloud inside of Atlassian. And I was actually overseeing that project. And we came to this point where we're like, okay, we've got 100 apps. I don't know if we were the 101 that they were talking about. But I didn't know, out of the 100 apps, which ones I really had to make sure were in cloud in order to migrate. And the way that we understood how to do that was usage reporting, the ability to see how used they are. The next big pain point is, of those apps that are being used enough, it's hard to tell which ones have full-featured counterparts. Really hard to tell. You'll see that many of them have the same named thing that says cloud, but what you'll find is often due to lack of APIs, which is on us, that the level of features are not there, right? But it's hard to tell that. You don't know what you're going to give up. The next thing is that of the apps that have full-featured counterparts, how many need to be migrated? In other words, their data is not living just in the core products. And then of the ones that need to be migrated, how many actually have a migration path? And this is very difficult. This is what leads to those problems that I was talking about in the actual downtime, is that you have to run a bunch of bespoke approaches to automated migration. And then this is maybe the killer is that, which by the way the Forge announcement has a huge impact on, is how many of these are being operated by vendors that are compliant enough for an enterprise to rely on. And this is, by the way, an absolute key point right here. I've seen many, many migration gigs blow up at the end when they realize, my God, that data is unfettered and it's ending up outside of the Atlassian hosted facility. In fact, I can count many where people are like, sorry, can't proceed, and that kills the migration right there. So it's very important to us, even on the road to having the full-blown forge, that we communicate this to the customer. So what is this going to look like in terms of implementation? And so Martin showed you a little bit of what I'll call like a watered-down version of this. He got the slide from me. But what I wanted to show you here is, first of all, I need to make the caveat that what you're seeing here may not be representative, and we'll see how long it takes us to get to this full vision. But the idea here is it's going to have some aspect of usage. It's going to say, all right, you're using this across X number of pages in the case of Confluence. Maybe we'll even triangulate that on which pages are relevant, have been viewed anytime recently, and really help people understand usage. By the way, we can also interrogate code path. We know whether or not an app has actually been executed. Then we'll tell you if it's available in cloud, whether or not it has achieved full parity, or if it's all the way to just name only, whether there's a migration path, and then the all-important link that will point people right from in product to you guys to get access to your marketplace listing, and the documentation that's going to help people understand, what the supported aspects are. So, one of the things I want you guys to take away from this is that this is an important development, because what this is suddenly it's shining a light for the customers. They can see it crystal clear, what their app situation is. So if you've been thinking about, as an example, but haven't pulled the trigger on building a cloud app, this is going to shine a light on the fact that you haven't. If you don't have a migration path and you need one, you should probably be thinking about that, which is essentially, what the next slide says, which is, as a vendor, what should you guys be concerned with? Well, the first is you heard Martin alluding to the Source of Truth project. So in a few weeks, we're going to be reaching out to all of our vendors, and we're going to be asking them to provide information about some of the things that I just talked about. And trust me when I say that it's in your best interest to provide that information. You don't want to miss the boat and have like a continuity problem because we have the wrong information in our assessment tool. So please do answer that call when it comes. The next thing is get cracking on your cloud apps if you don't have one. Same spiel. If people are at a point where all the momentum is moving towards cloud, you don't want to be the app that they had to give up when they made the transition. Next up is, if you don't have a migration path and you're dependent on your app needs one, then build one, because customers are going to need it. Same thing. They may decide not to move forward with your app because they can't move that data. And when you don't have the data, you might question whether or not you need the data. And then lastly is, Martin alluded to this as well, is that what we're seeing on the customer side is a standard security assessment that gets run as people are trying to decide, whether or not our cloud is right for them. And they're getting caught up in this extension of the security assessment to the apps vendors. So to anticipate this, you should be ready. Be ready with standard documentation. Get ready to be scaling around it, because the call will come as an extension of our security assessment process to dip into yours. Okay. So let's change gears. We'll get to the main event here, which is app data migration. Just a little bit on app assessment. App assessment will absolutely happen. How fast it happens and the degree to which we can give all the data that I just showed you, I think is speculative, but it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Now, app data migration is a little bit different. For me, it's the big testing the waters part. In order for it to be successful, and you'll see a POC architecture here in a minute, it really requires that we all, in collaboration, work together to make it work. It's only as strong, really, as its weakest link. So as we go through this section, I'd like you guys to be thinking about, what value do you think this would provide you and our mutual customers, and whether or not you feel like you can be a part of this, really lean into it. And one of the things that I'm essentially assessing here and in our interactions and dialogues over the next few weeks is whether the ecosystem wants to do this. So let me tell you what it is. So back to the processes. What we're going to zero in on now is what actually happens during a migration. So again, pain points. I'm a product manager, so I like to talk pain points. The big problems that people are hitting right now in this part is that, and this is not any sort of a slight on anybody, is that in order to do app migration requires that our customers have one-on-one relationships with every single vendor. And I know a lot of our vendors enjoy that because they look for an opportunity to sell services and other things. But if you're trying to migrate, 10, 20, God forbid, 101 apps, it doesn't scale. And it literally complicates and prolongs the migration lifecycle. The next pain point is that apps have confusingly varying levels of support for migration. Some just work because they're not actually based on any special data, they're just based on product data, and others have hardcore like migration capabilities. And just the degrees of the differences in the various implementations make for very, very nervous customer. The next thing is that apps have confusingly varying levels of support for versions. Some apps can handle migrating or being on the latest version only of something, and others can go all the way back. And as I was alluding to earlier with the fact that we build a plugin, is we're trying to be the broadest in terms of flexibility. And so I've had some partners tell me we just always upgrade to the latest version because we don't know how to deal with all the app variants. And then the last one, which I've alluded to a couple of times, is that when it comes to the actual downtime, you're juggling so many dependencies that you're taking an already high pressure downtime and you're making it just terribly high pressure. Okay, so to talk about just a little bit of an early mock-up, kind of a silly slide, is the answer is we don't know. The proof of concept that I'm going to show you, architecture I'm going to show you here in a second, actually assumes that there is not a UI around individual app migration. The idea being that if vendors code to the framework is that it's just going to work. But this is another thing that as you think about what this might look like for your own apps is to think about. Do you need a UI, as it were, to configure and to set up the migration? And if so, then we'll have to get cracking on a way to give you that UI and have it show up at the right points along the way. But it is kind of an open question for me. I will say that the proof of concept that I'll show you doesn't have a UI. We were able to get away with not having one. So just think about that as we start to dialogue over the next few weeks, is whether you do need an interactive UI for migration. Okay, so here's where we get to what I think is kind of the fun part. A little bit of background on this is we started kicking around an architecture for migration about 6 months ago. And the whole idea was, can we pull something together that is simple enough, that vendors will adopt, that will work, that has all the itties. It's reliability, security, et cetera. And I'm happy to say that we were pleasantly surprised by what we found. But all caveats, none of this has been decided to be pursued. It's all here for early dialogue. So a couple of core principles for what we call the app migration framework. The first is, as I said, it has to be easy to adopt. We need to leverage existing export-import functionalities that some of you have already built, if we can. Next up, it has to be generic and it has to be scalable. With thousands of apps on Marketplace, we can't afford to build just one bespoke migration for every single app. That just would not scale for us, and frankly, I don't know that it would be good for the customer. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that the app migration was as smooth of an experience as we can make it. And for that meant, as I've been alluding to, really tight integration with the migration assistants. Okay? All right, so let's talk architecture. What you're seeing here is on the left-hand side, you see the JIRA Confluence server. And I have a little bit of a font problem. This is server app and migration app. On the right-hand side, you essentially have the cloud divided into two pieces. On the lower right side, you see the Atlassian Cloud, and on the upper part is the third party, the external to Atlassian Cloud that many of our vendors have. And so the way this flow works is we start essentially with the migration assistant notifying, because remember it's running inside a server, notifying your server app that a migration has started, and asking your app to do a dump, an export of the information that it has, the data that it needs to be migrating. And the beauty of this is that no matter whether you're storing it inside of active objects or you're writing in some attribute table or even stuffing stuff in attachments, which a lot of people do, you essentially are going to tell us and do most of this yourself. You're going to dump it into a form that we can then hand you back on the other side of this whole thing. Then what we're going to do is we're going to store your export in our infrastructure. We're going to stick it into a data store, alongside a very important piece, which is what we call the migration context. So half the battle of actually doing a migration to cloud is in all the ID remappings that will occur. Almost every single entity that server has, from spaces to projects to JIRA entities, like you name it, has some sort of an ID in server that is going to be remapped to an ID in cloud. So just to put a finer point on that, every one of these things essentially has a mapping. So this migration context I'm talking about is being built for the express purpose of allowing you on the other side of all this to be given the mapping file so that you can do the needful on your side to provide that mapping. So this is an absolute crucial part. And in fact, I would say that without this part, it's very difficult to handle migrations. This is the heart of the matter. Okay, so back to the flow. What's going to happen then is that once we've established the migration context, we've stored the application import, is we're going to turn around and we're going to make a call, an endpoint call on the external app cloud service. So, okay, a migration has occurred. Get ready for it. At this point, we'll give the app service access to the export file and that migration context. Okay? And so to perform the import, what you'll do as an app vendor at this point will be highly specific to your app. But typically, this is where we'd expect your app to store the export inside of the external app cloud service and perform API calls to the target cloud site. In this case, it says JIRA Cloud. Making calls to inject the data that needs to be in cloud itself. Okay. So hopefully this is pretty clear. I think one of the things that we learned through all of this is that it doesn't need to be complicated. We were able to find, I was very happy about it, we were able to find a fairly simple pattern that we think will work. But again, as you think about whether or not this will work for your apps, just be ready to tell us whether you think this is too simple or whether you need something more sophisticated. Okay. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about. So we had a hackathon with just a couple of vendors a few weeks back, and these were guys that we had been talking to because they reached directly out to us, and so we said, hey, come to Sydney and let's kick this around. Essentially what we're trying to do is validate this architecture would actually hold water, and we spent 3 days together sort of hacking. The learnings from that were, the first one is that it worked. We were able to get an end-to-end migration flow for one of the apps that came, and this is the other learning, we learned that some entities are so difficult that we weren't able to do so in the other app. What we learned is that, probably not too big of a surprise, is that we had missing APIs. In other words, we couldn't provide the depth of access with the second app that we needed. We needed workflow extensions, post functions, those sorts of things. Buried so deep in JIRA that exporting and re-importing them was not easy. So what we've learned in this is that it will be a journey. It'll take us some time to build out the infrastructure inside of JIRA and Confluence and to ultimately provide this. But if we so choose to do so, it's not rocket science. We know what we need to do. Okay, so I want to stop here just for a second. Just raise of hands, like who in this room would find value in a framework not unlike what I just showed? Okay, yeah, that's a lot of folk. Okay, who in the room would be willing to invest in adapting to this framework and providing this not only as a first-time service, but maintaining it over time? Okay, almost as many people. Great. Who in the room would like to see a working demo of this actually in operation? Okay, great. All right, so before I show this, the first thing I want to do is just huge thanks to the Code Barrel guys. They were one of the guys that met with us. And what I'm actually going to show you, and I love doing this, is not me talking for a change, but the Code Barrel guy talking through how it works. And to set a little bit of context, What we're looking at right here is we're inside of a JIRA server with the code barrel app. And what he's going to do is he's going to show you how, using an early build of the JIRA migration assistant, he's going to show you actually go through the process of a migration. So let me shut up and we'll listen to him.
Good day everyone, we're just going to demo for you migrating some third-party app automation for JIRA, some automation rules from server to cloud. So this is my project. If we just go and have a look at what we're exporting, we'll just go into the project settings. Alright, and down here, project automation. Excellent, and this is our rule that we're exporting, so it's referring to a custom field here, so we're expecting to see that match when we get to it in cloud, and potentially the status as well. Alright, let's go to the migration assistant.
First time anybody's seen it outside of Atlassian.
Let's quickly create a new plan. We'll just make sure we export just the one project. Alright, and we'll run that now.
It's a progress bar that works.
Just have a look at what's happening here. Just go back now and we'll go to cloud and see if we can import that that rule. So we'll just go to my cloud instance. Open automation for JIRA. And up here we can just go to migrations. And there's our rule. We've got an issue with the mappings at the moment, so otherwise we would have the correct project selected here, so we'll just get that now. And we'll go next and import that. And here's our rule here. It doesn't show up under global because it's assigned to a project. And there we go. We can see by the one in the brackets that it's mapped the custom field name, and obviously I already had that in the cloud, so it's had to give it a different name. It's picked up the correct status, and there you go. There is a demo of exporting automation to the cloud.
Woo! Yeah. Thank you. We were very excited. We accomplished this in about 3, actually maybe 4 days. Like I said, we had two vendors with us. This was the one that worked because it was in the sweet spot, and a lot of confidence, I think, on the team that we were able to do this. Okay, so what does this boil down for you as app vendors? What can you do to be a part of this, and what should you be thinking about as we get closer to it? The first thing is, and I said this before, if you don't have a migration path and your app needs one, please build one. Customers are going to need it, so you're going to probably hear me be a broken record on that. Don't make them lose the data and restart from scratch. The next thing is, so independent of whether we actually build a framework, the pattern was pretty simple. You're going to do an export, you're going to do an import. Go ahead and do that. It'll foster consistency. When we come around with our framework later, it'll be easy for you to adapt to it. Next up, if you find the architecture I presented today compelling, let me or your other Atlassian friends know. I'll tell you in a second about how to reach out and dialogue with us on this. And then lastly, is when and if we decide to move forward with an EAP program, please be a part of it. The more people we have, the more we're going to learn, the more we're going to build something that's going to work long term for our customers. Okay? And so what I was alluding to in terms of how to interact with us is so in the next day or so, we're going to unveil a new community forum for this. It'll be locked down to vendors. It'll be at go.atlassian.com/app-migration. And the first post, which is already there, will it be me asking, for dialoguing about the value, about what you think about the solution, what it's missing, what it needs, that kind of thing. So I'll see you in the forum. I'm really looking forward to the interaction on this. If the value's there, we're going to proceed to build it. So thank you very much. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, Chris.